welcome back. I struggled to think about topics for the day. That's actually not true. I have a lot of topics that I'm thinking about, but don't have enough knowledge of, I would say, which I feel like is okay for something like this, but just to work out thoughts. But I just felt like I need to think a little bit more before out loud thinking. What I did settle on is reading and mental health. Just the importance of literature, fiction, nonfiction, doesn't really matter. They both have really important characteristics, but the thing that was sticking out to me the most, and this has been true for me for a long time, is the connection to the past and the future that books tend to have. So that question of, is reading useful? What does it do? What's the point of it? I think, yes, it's very useful to do. For one, it's a really, really interesting skill when you think about it. And most people nowadays can read and can read at a young age. When you think about what it does, it's just your eyes scanning something and you're taking in images and getting pretty detailed understanding of what you're seeing and learning. And what's super interesting to me is different languages allow for different understandings because they have different words. A very common example is English has the word love, and that's kind of the only version of that word we have. Greek has multiple, Spanish has multiple that mean the same but similar. And then many other languages have just more expounding of certain meaning in their words. And so I find it interesting that depending on what language you speak, you might even be limited in how you can express yourself. And same with reading, which is why, I'm not completely fluent in another language, but I'm well versed enough in Spanish and can read it typically pretty well, and then a little bit of the other Latin languages as well, French and Italian. Those not nearly as good as Spanish, and definitely not to the level of English for comprehension and understanding, but it's very interesting to see how things read in different languages and how we understand things differently depending on how we've learned to speak or read. But the overall thought that I was sitting with was just this idea of books specifically are an amazing connection to the past primarily, and actually to empathy. Our ability to read a book and connect with characters can help, I think, a lot with empathy. And I think the type of person who can read a story and see the perspective of every character is likely someone who can do a decent job at empathy in real life, at least in the stories I hear about the world. And there are kind of two things that I actually brought with me from my bookshelf that I find very interesting, and the connection to the past, and why I think this is not going to be true for everyone, but for me, from a therapeutic lens, it's very connecting to the bigger picture of life, which being able to view life as something bigger than you, your role in the big picture of life, and how you play into and contribute to the betterment of all society, that is actually very indicative of good mental health. People who can do that often are healthier overall, have better relationships, and just in general are going to connect to their community and their self better, which is really interesting. So the more you can understand how you connect to the past and to the bigger picture of life, the better your mental health is going to be, because you're going to be less selfish and less self-centered. And we know that if you're selfish and self-centered, you actually don't typically have extremely good mental health usually. So there's lots of other factors that tie into that, but that's an indicator of overall maturity in life. So two things. One, I brought the Aeneid, which is, I believe, from somewhere around like 30 BC, I think. I brought this example. I could have brought in the Bible because it's actually older, but there's so many parts that it's written before this and after this that I thought I'd keep it a little bit more simple and go with this one. But whether it's the Bible, the Homer's works, the Aeneid, these types of stories, when you read this story and go through this book, one of the things that connects to me so much is reading this today, knowing that people for years, decades, centuries, millennia in some cases have also read this. Obviously, translations are different. I generally don't really buy it when people say things are passed down so much that we've lost the original meaning. I think that happens with some things, but translations are actually, as far as I can tell, a very refined art, and there are better and worse ones. And if you're really interested, you can read different translations. That's where a Bible is super interesting, is if you really want to get an understanding of like a chapter, to read it in maybe 10 different versions and try to pick reliable ones, because there are some that just flat out suck. But trying to pick some unanimously reliable ones, and you'll see most of it's going to be the same. And where there are differences comes down to what I said before, words that have maybe multiple meanings or ways of communication that we don't have in English, and the translator just has to pick an English word that makes the most sense in context for even today's reader, because it's not just about translating to English, it's also about translating to English that we understand today, which is why if you read, this book exactly, it is written in more modern day. I think this exact version was written and translated and published in 1970, I think, if I can find the copyright page. So even that's still, geez, at this point, over 50 years, 1990, a little bit wrong. So, over 30 years ago, this one close to 35 years, which is still mostly the same language. But if it was maybe a couple hundred years ago, this would be translated to English, but it would be probably more Elizabethan English, probably not so much American English at the time, but for whatever, America wasn't even technically real, but hundreds of years ago, it'd be more Elizabethan, how we read Shakespeare, and that's how it would be translated, so that that audience, in the way that they understand English, could read it. So there's always going to be some cultural aspects of that translation that makes it separate from the original, but the idea still remains that if you read this book in English, if you read it in Spanish, if you read it in Greek, if you read it 300 years ago, 300 years from now, we could all talk about that book and understand it together pretty consistently. And that amazes me too, that people will probably still be reading this one. If it's made it over 2,000 years, it's probably going to last hundreds more. So that to me is something that's amazing, that when you read this, you share a history with other people in existence who have also read this book. And I sit with that every time. And it might sound kind of weird, but I get a little bit emotional about it at times, because it's really, really cool. It's a very, very unique way to connect to the past. And I feel the same way when I'm out and about or visiting places, and I find, an old building or art that's been there, or even seeing the redwoods and like touching a tree, and you're like, this tree has been here for longer than our country's been here, and it has been here longer than anything really that I could fathom. And it has probably also been around people, and that's this weird connection that I have of like, oh, I've touched that tree and so has someone else. And that might sound silly, but this interesting connection to the past, and that so much of what existed in the past still is relevant and present today. And we don't really just stay stagnant as we move through time. There's influence that continues through that. So understanding history, understanding the past, understanding your role and how you connect to that is amazing. And then when we read things like this, knowing that you are also reading something that someone in the past was reading, even if it was just printed yesterday, you're still getting the same story. So that's kind of part one to this. Part two, and I grabbed the oldest book that I have in terms of print. I actually have I think it's somewhere in here, some sheet music that's from the 1800s, which is very fragile and I didn't want to get out. But so that's very old sheet music. But this book is, which you probably can't tell, I'll hold it up closer, published in 1902. It is, let's see, you can see that, if you can read it at all, Life and Health, which I think this is hilarious that it's, of all the old books I have, it's a book on health. I remember when COVID was starting, I opened this book up and I'm like, I wonder what this book says about viruses, and if it has any like SARS information or anything like that. And it's got some interesting pictures and writings. So, but why this book? The first book is a connection to the past in terms of you're reading something that other people have read. This book, written in 1902, and it actually has notes from people renting it from a library. That comes through well enough. So, what's interesting to me is not only is this book informationally shared with the past by reading, but this exact book was held by people in 1902 and it was read by them. And so there's an even more direct connection of like this exact book that I'm holding has been held by people over 120 years ago. And when I read it, I'm actually reading the exact same physical copy that they read. That stuff is wild to me as well. Same when you go ever visit, maybe you own one, or if you've gone to visit a very old house and you go inside it, like it's crazy to think people lived there and what they had that what they didn't have that you do have now, and how life has changed. But sharing the exact same item with someone and how you connect with the past and getting the same information. I especially love that when people, and I don't think this book has any, but I've seen a couple. Oh, there's a couple notes in here actually. Look at that right as I say that. It's funny when people leave notes, and I'm like, that's like an extra form of communication, just like so many people do in textbooks and other books that they read. They write little notes, and maybe if you borrow someone's book, you read it and see what they write. But then it's crazy to think that this was probably written over 100 years ago in here. And that stuff just kind of blows my mind, especially for a medical book, because these can get outdated very quickly as new research and updates come around. So these things don't typically stay super well in circulation over time. Like it's pretty rare that you have like classic medical books, and when they are classics, they're not necessarily ones that you read to learn from. They're just more like this book was very impactful and was used for multiple decades instead of just like 4 years for a college class. So just a encouragement, I think, from a mental health perspective of try to understand your place in history. The more you can know your family history, the better. The more you can know your cultural and ethnic history, the better. Everything from the country you're currently in to where your family immigrated from, what's been passed down, where your people come from. And this, you can do this kind of ad infinitum, right? Because eventually we're kind of all going to end up back at the same place. And that gets messy with how people argue, like, well, I'm from here and I'm from here. And it's like, well, when I hear that with Americans, I'm like, most Americans I meet are from America and haven't immigrated. They've just lived here their whole life. And then it just depends on how far back you go before you say, well, I'm this and I'm this. And ethnically and culturally, it's just kind of where you arbitrarily draw lines sometimes. But nonetheless, that's where your family's from. That's your influence. And understanding that part of your history, connecting with your history, connecting with human history too. One of my favorite things to do when I go visit new places is to try to get some sort of book about that area and the history of that area. And if I can, I like to get it earlier on in the trip so I can read it while I'm there. So, the most recent trip for me that I can think of that I did that was to San Francisco and buying a book about San Francisco. And not so much a travel guide, but just a book that talked about the city from it was from a local's perspective of the city history and impact of certain things. And that was really cool. And some of the places in there I never went to, and some of the places I did go to, and I'm like, oh, I was there. I'm reading about this thing, and then this person's telling me history of it. And that's amazing to me. And same going to visit the Redwoods and buying a book about someone who influenced that. I mean, John Muir was the person, and that book's fascinating to read. So that's how I try to do, is connect myself with wherever I'm going. And then, of course, just talking to people if I know anyone local there, just learning more of their history and the history of that area. And history, I think, is a very exciting topic for anyone who wants it to be. It doesn't mean everyone likes reading history books or watching history shows, but understanding the past and how we connect to it. Very important. Understanding how you connect to the bigger picture of life And knowing that, yeah, when you go to work today, or when you go to school, or when you go spend time with a friend, it's important and it has an effect on that person's life, and the things that you do in your day to day are going to affect the world. And that can be really scary if you're wasting your life away, but it can be really encouraging if you know, yeah, I'm working on something that is good for the world. And if you can work on something that you know will outlast you or potentially not even be finished until after you die, I think that can be one of the most encouraging things of this mission statement that I have is so much bigger than me that I won't see it completed. Trying to find these connections with the past and with your connection to the bigger picture is, I think, freeing in a lot of ways that people don't understand it will be. So if you don't have those connections, really think about it and press into it and see what you can discover. And I'm someone who has those connections and still wants to press deeper. I don't fully know the past and my connection with it. I don't fully know everything that I'm doing that's part of the big picture. But every day I try to draw those a little bit closer, or at least every week and month or whatever, getting closer to understanding both those things and getting a deeper understanding, I should say, because I know them to some extent. So that's my encouragement. Go read some books, understand your history and understand the history of people, and try to get a better idea of where you fit into the big picture and how what you're doing is helpful to the world in a way that is even just a little bit bigger than you. That's my encouragement. Thanks y'all for coming. If you're interested in any therapy services in Kansas and Missouri, reach out in my contact info. I'll get you connected with myself or someone else. If you're interested in services outside of those two states, you can still reach out and I'll do what I can to get you connected out of state and help you get what you need. So thanks everyone, and I'll look forward to seeing you next Monday.